delighted to welcome you back as we continue our studies of the Greek of the New Testament. If you've been following along, you know that at this point we're coming to chapter 22 of Machen's text, which treats the subject of infinitives. The infinitive, as you know, is a form of the verb in which the verb is actually being used something like a noun. So in the English language, we'll use the helping preposition to in order to form the infinitive. We talk about to run, to walk, to study Greek, and so on, and that word to is used with the verb in order to form the infinitive. And you'll notice that the infinitive therefore can function in a sentence just like a noun. I could say, for example, to run is enjoyable. Well, at that point, the subject of that sentence is in fact the infinitive. To run functions as the subject, and then I can say certain things about it. To run makes me tired, for example, that kind of thing. Well, in the Greek language, the infinitive is used in precisely the same sense. The only difference is that, of course, in Greek, you don't have a preposition that's being applied, but simply the form of the verb itself, and especially the ending, is what is used to form the infinitive. So, for example, if you look at the text here in Machen, you have 6 forms of the infinitive based on the present, middle, and active voice, and also the difference between the present and the aorist tense. So in the present, we have luein, luesthai, luesthai, and then in the aorist, we have lusai, lusosthai, luthenai, and those 6 then are the basic forms of the infinitive. We do have, of course, the second aorist. You'll want to pay particular attention to Machen's discussion of the fact that the accent is irregular in the second aorist, and also you'll notice that the accent is irregular in the aorist passive. So just make sure you understand that. That's explained by Machen in a reasonably straightforward way, so I don't want to add anything to it. The main thing that you want to be aware of as we're using the infinitive is that for the most part the infinitive can be translated in the same idiom in English that we find it in Greek, but there is an important distinction when it comes to what's called the articular infinitive, and that would be the case in which an article is being used with the infinitive. And you can understand why that would be the case in Greek, even though we don't specifically use it that way in English. But in Greek you would have the idea of the, to run, you see, that idea, the article going with the infinitive, then to run. We would translate something like that more on the order of the act of running, or the act of to run, you see. That's the literal sense of it. Obviously you're not going to translate it that woodenly, but that would be the idea. So watch out for that, and you'll find that the articular infinitive is used very, very commonly in the New Testament, and it's a good idea to get a pretty good idea as to how that functions even at this point in your studies. The other thing that you want to be aware of is that the articular infinitive can also be used with prepositions. For example, if I use the preposition meta, which with the accusative means after, well, with the articular infinitive I would say meta, after to, the article, after the, and then to loose, after the act of loosing. So after the act of loosing is roughly the same thing as what we talked about with participles, the aorist participle referring to action preceding the time of the leading verb, and that would be something like having loosed. And so in a sense you can express the same idea 2 different ways. You can use the preposition meta with the articular infinitive to express having loosed, or after the act of loosing, and you can also use the aorist participle. You want to keep an eye on that because sometimes the case of the article is going to depend on the preposition that's being used. If I were to say dia, to, that is through the act of, then I want to be sure that I have the article in the genitive case, even though the infinitive is going to look the same. So I could say through dia to luein, that would be through the act of loosing, or I could say dia to luein, which would be on account of the act of loosing. Do you see the difference? The use of the article is going to be basically dependent on what case of the preposition that we're going to be using. So just be sure you're thinking about that as you go along in the exercises. One other little idiomatic distinction that we have here is the use of the preposition ace. And if I were to say ace to luane, into the act of loosing, idiomatically in Greek that means in order to or for the effect of, you see, with this intention in mind. I did this in order that this act of loosing might take place. It's something, therefore, roughly comparable to hina with the subjunctive that we looked at in an earlier chapter. Same idea, so just be aware of that as you're going along. These are the principal ideas that we're going to be dealing with in this chapter. I think you'll again find this chapter fairly straightforward. Probably the trickiest part of the infinitives is keeping your eye on these accents, which were a little bit unexpected, especially in the aorist and the aorist passive, the second aorist, I should say, and the aorist passive. But beyond that, it's fairly straightforward. I don't think you'll have any great difficulty with it. One more thing that's included in this chapter that you want to be aware of is the use of indirect discourse. Indirect discourse can use the infinitive, and in that case, the subject of the infinitive will be in the accusative case. Machen gives an example of that, you'll notice, on the page, 139. The men were saying that he was a prophet. Well, the word anai, was, is in the infinitive, and the he, there, being a prophet, is in the accusative case. So just want to keep an eye on that. The other, however, more common use of the indirect or indirect discourse in Greek is simply using the word hoti. Hoti means that, and you would find that, for example, in a sentence such as, he said that he was going to the store, you know, that idea. Well, this word that is then giving us the indirect discourse. He said that he would make a cake. Well, I'm referring to a conversation that took place in the past. I will make a cake. You see, I might make that statement. Someone might later report that statement to another and say, he said that he would make a cake. Well, in the Greek, we're going to use hoti, and then we're going to use the verb that was originally expressed in the tense in which it was originally expressed. And so if I were to make that statement, I will make a cake, you'll notice that it's in the future tense at the time that I say it. If someone later reports that statement, they would say, he said that he would make a cake. And the use of the word would there is again reflecting that this is a future intention at the time that the statement was made. Well, in Greek, or in English, we use something like a subjunctive there. He said that he would make a cake. But in Greek, you actually report the statement in its original tense. Literally, it would read something like this. He said that he will make a cake, you know. And so the tense is calibrated according to the leading verb in the sentence. If I were to say, I am making a cake, then if that were reported later, someone might say, he said that he was making a cake. I use the word was there, which is the imperfect tense, but if I were saying that in Greek, then I would actually use the present tense because the verb was present at the time that the original statement was made. If I were to say to someone, I made a cake, as in made a cake yesterday, so it was past tense at the time that I made the statement, then to report that later, someone might say, he said that he had made a cake. You see, that's the English pluperfect, but in Greek, you simply use the aorist tense. So he said that he made a cake, and you would use that. And again, the tense of the indirect discourse is calibrated against the leading verb in the sentence. Hope that makes sense. As we go through, I'll explain that using the exercises or the examples that Machen provides for us, but that's the fundamental idea. So we're going to use the same approach we typically do. We'll look at the vocabulary words first of all, then we'll look at some of the examples that Machen himself provides in this chapter, and we'll wrap up by treating the first three of the sets of exercises, the translation and composition exercises. And once again, I'll let you go to work from that point on the rest of the exercises. And hopefully this will be a fairly straightforward chapter for you and incorporating into your understanding a quite important aspect of Greek grammar. So let's look at these vocabulary words. You notice that Machen actually provides for us certain vocabulary words which are distinctively associated with the infinitive. So for example, the first one we have here, which is pronounced day, this word means it is necessary. And you notice that the idea it is necessary obviously anticipates that we're going to have an infinitive involved. It is necessary to study. You see, to study is an infinitive, and it naturally follows from this word day. It is necessary. You only find it in the New Testament in the third person singular, present tense. So it is necessary is always going to be in the very form that you see it here. Similarly, we could say of this word existen that it's a third person singular. That's the only form in which we find it in the New Testament, and it means it is lawful. And once again, you'll notice this word expects the infinitive. It is lawful to go the speed limit. Well, to go is an infinitive, and it follows rather naturally from this statement, it is lawful. So these two are very common in the New Testament and used in connection with the infinitive, and so that's why Machen introduces them here. Similarly, we have here the word thelo. Thelo means I wish. You may be aware of the controversy in Christian history that goes back to the early centuries of the church, in which it was called the monothelite heresy. The question about whether Jesus had one will or two, and that comes from this word thelo. We have thelema already, which is a word that means will, and so we have a similar word at our disposal. But this word thelo means I wish, and once again you can see that it naturally expects the infinitive. I wish to speak clearly. To speak there is the infinitive, and it follows rather naturally from this word thelo. We have our first proper noun in this chapter. This is the word Jesus. Obviously, this is the name for Jesus. This is the first time we've had a capital letter, so we're going to start incorporating some capital letters as we go along. This is the capital iota. Notice that the breather goes immediately before it. So we have Jesus. We have a circumflex on the ultima there. And another new word, proper noun, udaios. Udaios means Jew. The plural, more commonly in the New Testament, udaioi, Jews. Again, we have the breather immediately preceding the iota. So those two words, of course, are going to give us an ability now to begin using proper nouns in our Greek sentences. Next word we have is kaluo. Kaluo. This word means I command. Again, you'll find this is naturally expecting an infinitive to show up in the sentence. I command you to do this thing. To do, you see, is infinitive. The you in that statement would be accusative, so I command you, accusative, to do, infinitive, this thing. Kaluo. Kome, simply the word that means village, and I don't know any English derivatives for that one, so you just have to learn that one. It's a feminine noun, he kome. Mellow is a word that means about to. I am about to, or I am going to, meaning going to in a fairly immediate sense. Mellow also, you'll notice, is expecting the infinitive. I am about to go to the store. You know, well, to go is infinitive. It follows naturally from this statement, mellow, I am about. Ophelo, similarly, means I ought, in the sense that I ought to study Greek more diligently. That notion, well, that expects the infinitive. To study is the infinitive, and so Ophelo expects that as well. Pasco means I suffer, and so that is probably related to our word passion to some degree, and that's the sense in which we think of it. Obviously, this is a word that's used rather frequently in the New Testament. Pasco, I suffer. Here, the word pro, as you know, is a word that means before. We have, of course, many English words that use some form of the word pro. We have the word proceed, for example, and various other words. Simply means before with the genitive case. Soteria, we've had soter, savior. This is soteria, salvation, and it's a feminine noun, obviously very common in the New Testament. Or pharisaios in the singular is Pharisee, And again, this is a proper noun, so here's another new capital letter, the capital Phi, which looks like that. And pharisaios. By the way, the original meaning of this was to be separated. So it comes from another verb that we haven't looked at yet, which has to do with separation. So that was the original sense of that word. The Pharisees were the separated ones in the history of the Jewish nation, really probably originating around the time of the Maccabean revolt back there around 165 BC. Christos, again, we have a capital Chi here. This is, of course, the word for Christ. And we find this commonly, very commonly, obviously in the New Testament. Chi came to be the universal symbol for Christ, and you may be aware of the Chi Rho symbol, which has a rho superimposed on a chi, and that was a symbol as well for Christ. So those are our vocabulary words, and hopefully those won't be too difficult to master. Let's go ahead and take a look at the conjugation here of the infinitive for luo. You have it in the textbook. It's luane, luisthai, luisthai. So you notice that the middle and passive in the present tense are identical, and that's similar to what we've seen in other uses of the verb. When we come to the aorist, we have lusai, and as I noted earlier, the accent, which is a circumflex, stays on that syllable, the penult. So in the aorist infinitive, you're going to keep the accent on the penult even if the verb has more syllables than that. So that is an irregularity. Then we have lusasthai. This is the middle. Of course, it's used largely with deponent verbs in our studies. And then luthenai. And again, notice the accent here is irregular. We have a short ultima, so we would expect the accent to be on the antepenult. But in the aorist passive infinitive, the irregular accent, it stays there on the penult, and so that's where you want to remember to put it in the exercises. The infinitive of the word I am is to be, as in Hamlet, to be or not to be. Well, this is anai, and it means to be, and so that, of course, shows up rather commonly in the New Testament. All right, let's take a look at some of the examples that Machen himself provides. These are quite helpful, and I think they'll give you an idea about how the articular infinitive works. So the first one we have here is in to legain autus tauta. In means in, but when it's used with the infinitive, it means in, usually in the sense of during, or in the act of. So what you want to do is think about this article here, the to, in to, as meaning something like in the act of. The infinitive is going to be to speak, or to say, I should say. So in the to say, and roughly in the act of saying, or while saying. You see, that's the way we would render that, while saying, or in the act of saying. The subject of an infinitive is going to be in the accusative. And so if it's accusative here, then obviously the subject is going to be in the act of they saying. That's very poor English, but I want you to get the feel for it. So we would translate it while they were saying. Does that make sense? In the to say them. That's literally what it is. While they were saying is the way we would render that into English. While they were saying, or even while they are saying, depending on the time of the leading verb, then tauta, simply these things. So you get that? That's the idea. And if you follow that, then you've got a pretty good idea of how the infinitive is going to function. So in the act of saying, or while they were saying these things. Next sentence we have meta to apoluthenai ton oklon apelthen hokurios. So again we have a similar idea. Notice meta. Meta means after. It takes the accusative. So this article is in the accusative. After the act of, we'll translate that, and then apoluthenai. This is, of course, from apoluo, to release. You'll notice that this is the aorist passive infinitive. Therefore, we have the irregular accent on the penult here. And so it's going to be after the act of having been released. You see, so the aorist passive sense of the infinitive there. After the act of having been released, the crowd happens to be the subject. They are the ones that are being released. So after the crowd had been released, is the way we'd put that, then hokurios, the Lord, apelthon, from aperkamai, went away. So it is a little bit of a strange idiom. We obviously don't speak quite this way in English, and it's very important before you start wrestling with a good translation to actually think like a Greek. And that means rigidly translating it and really just hearing it in the Greek syntax. After the to be released, the crowd, the Lord went away. So after the crowd had been released, the Lord went away. Let's take a look at the third of these. We have dia, de, to, legasthai, tuto, hupo, ton, oklon, apelthin, ho, apostolos. So what do we have? Well, we have dia. Dia, we know, is a preposition, and it can take the genitive or the accusative. So I look and see here, oh, it's the accusative. This could have been to, and then it would be the meaning through thee. But in this case, it's taking the accusative, and so it means on account of or because of the postpositive de, and on account of the, read the act of, and then legasthai, present, passive, infinitive, on account of the act of being said. You see, being said, to be said, in a sense, is the passive sense. This, on account of this being said by the crowds, hupoton oklon, by the crowds, ho apostolos, the apostle, went away. Because this had been said by the crowds, the apostle went away. That's the idea. If you kind of follow how those examples work, then you'll be able to work your way through this chapter on the infinitives without a great deal of difficulty. The last of the examples that he provides is here, tauta de epon humen, eis to me genesthai, humas, doulos, tes hamartias. Tauta, these things, and or but, and these things, epon, I said, or they said, could be either one, humen, to you, eis to me genesthai. All right, well, eis, of course, is into, takes the accusative, here's the article, into the act of, or for the effect of, you see. Me is the negation used with non-indicative moods. So into the effect of not becoming. Genesthai, of course, a deponent verb here, genomai, to become. So this is the present, middle, or passive, could be either one. To become. You, infinitive, takes the accusative, and so I said these things to you to the effect that you would not become, doulos, slaves of sin. You would not become slaves of sin. Normally, genesthai, of course, takes, you recall, the nominative. But when you're using it in the infinitive, then the doulos is going to stay in the accusative as well. So that's the reason we find it in this form here. So I said these things to you to the effect that you would not become slaves of sin, or for the purpose, or for the intent, or for the effect, or to the effect that you would not become slaves of sin. The final set of examples provided by Machen are really intended to explain the use of indirect discourse. So I thought I'd just comment on these briefly, especially with respect to, as I say, calibrating the verb that's referring to the original conversation to the time of the leading verb. So notice what we have here. Lege, he says, hati, that, blepe, he sees, ton, apostolon, the apostle. He says that he sees the apostle. All right, so in the present tense, that would be exactly the way you'd put it. He says that he sees the apostle, and the whole thing is taking place in the present. The indirect discourse is introduced by this word hoti, that. In this case, he said, epen, hoti, that, blepe, he sees, still present tense, ton, apostolon, the apostle. Well, if we translate that, it's going to be he said that, he saw. Notice that. In English, we put the tense of the verb, which is part of the indirect discourse, into the same time frame as the leading verb. But in Greek, you do not do that. You keep it in the tense of the original statement. So he said that he saw the apostle, even though blepe in Greek is going to be in the present tense. Let's look at the third one. Epen, he said, ho mathetes, the disciple, said, hoti, that. Aden, now this is aorist, notice that. He saw, ton, apostolon. Forgot my breather there. He said that he saw the apostle. Well, because aden is already aorist, we have to throw it behind the tense of the leading verb, and we would put it this way. The disciple said that he had seen the apostle. Do you see that? So aden tells us that the time of the original discourse is referring to the past tense, and so it's going to be going behind the tense here of the leading verb in the sentence. And then finally, he said, hoti, that, opsatai, he will see the apostle. And to put this into English, we would use a form of the subjunctive. He said that he would see the apostle. So just be aware that idiomatically that's the way we translate these. It's actually easier in Greek because we're simply using the original tense of the verb, but to make good English translations, we have to massage our wording just a little bit so it's a little bit more pleasing to the English ear. All right, well with that, let's go ahead and take a look at the first three of the translation exercises. We have here, first of all, number 1, uk, existen, soi, ekein, autein. Well, we know this word existen means it is lawful. It's in the indicative mood, actually, so we use uk, it is not lawful. We have the pronoun soi. That's why we add, of course, the accent here on the ultima, pursuant to the rules of enclitic accent, where we have an accent on the antepenult, followed by a enclitic. We add a separate accent on the ultima. So it is not lawful. Soi in the dative, for you. It is not lawful for you. Ekein is the infinitive of echo, I have. So this is to have. Autein, this is the feminine pronoun, accusative case, and thus we would translate it her. So it is not lawful for you to have her. This is a case where the infinitive is being used in a very straightforward sense, and our translation into English is going to mimic almost precisely the use of the infinitive in Greek. The second exercise we have here, kalusos da tous oklus, apoluthenai, exaelthen eis tein erimon. All right, well, first thing off, we have this word kalusos. I notice that this is not augmented, so I know it's not indicative. That's what rules out any form of the aorist indicative here. And I realize that this has to be, therefore, the participle. And so kalusos is the nominative, masculine, aorist participle. So having commanded is going to be the basic sense, da, but having commanded tous oklus, the crowds, having commanded the crowds. Apoluthenai, this is the aorist passive infinitive, to be dismissed, therefore, you see, the aorist passive sense of it. Having commanded the crowds to be dismissed, exaelthen, he went out, eis tein erimon, into the desert. Does that make sense? Here we have the participle we've studied earlier, having commanded, the nominative, singular, masculine participle, having commanded, and therefore, by the way, is going to go with the subject of the sentence, which is he here. It's otherwise unexpressed. Having commanded the crowds to go away, he went out, eis tein erimon, into the desert. And finally, we have uk estin, kalon, labain, ton, arton, ton, teknon, kai, ekbalain, auton. All right, so uk is the negation, uk estin, it is. Remember that this is somewhat irregular, but after uk, estin may be accented on the first syllable, though normally it's accented on the ultima. So uk estin is the way it's pronounced. It is not. Kalon, good, in the neuter. It is not good. Labain, this is the second aorist of lambano. We have the second aorist stem lob with the present infinitive ending, but notice the irregular accent is used whenever you're using the second aorist. So it is not good to take, tone, the arton, bread, in the accusative case, tone, teknon, of the children, or we would say the children's bread, kai, and ekbalain, again a second aorist, so it's accented here on the ultima, and cast it out. Our tone here is, of course, agreeing with, I should say, auton is agreeing with arton, so it is referring to the bread, and thus it's in the masculine, accusative singular. It is not good to take the bread of the children, or the children's bread, and cast it out. Let's turn our attention to the composition exercises. We'll do the first three of these as well, and then I'll leave the rest of them to you. So the first of the composition exercises provided by Machen is on page 142. While Jesus was preaching the gospel to the people, the Pharisees were commanding the soldiers to bring him. So let's take the first part of that sentence, while Jesus was preaching the gospel to the people. There's two ways to do this. The first of these is the one we've just learned using the infinitive. So in, the act of, in to, euangelidzesthai, this is a deponent verb, of course, euangelidzomai, it's the present, and we're going to use the middle or passive ending here. So in the act of preaching the gospel, and then remember that the subject of an infinitive is in the accusative. Just keep that in mind. So we'll translate it, in the act of Jesus preaching the gospel. Remember that the word euangelidzomai normally takes the accusative, so even though we render it to the people, it would be common to find it in the accusative, literally gospeling the people, as we've talked about earlier. So in the event of, or in the fact of, or while Jesus was preaching the gospel to the people, I just want you to notice that we could also do this using the participle. So I've given you the alternative down here. This again would use the participle middle ending here in the genitive singular, because this would amount to a genitive absolute. So it's going to be euangelidzomenu, while preaching the gospel to Yesu. Now, to Yesu in this case is in the genitive because it's a genitive absolute. And again, I've put it here in the dative, even though normally it could be in the accusative. You'll also find it this way sometimes. So just to highlight, it could go either way. I'm just showing you the possible difference. But anyway, in the act, or while Jesus was preaching the gospel to the people, and then we have the rest of the sentence. The rest of the sentence reads, the Pharisees were commanding the soldiers to bring him. So, hoi Pharisaioi, the Pharisees, notice a short ending requires that there be a circumflex on the penult, because an accented long penult requires a circumflex when the last is short. So the Pharisees, ekeluon, this is the imperfect, were commanding, so we augment it, and we put the third person plural imperfect ending, ekeluon, were commanding, tous stratiotas, third declension noun, the soldiers, pharein, this is going to be the infinitive of the present, pharein, would be to bring. If you want to do the aorist infinitive, which would also be acceptable, it'd be a form of enegka. We don't augment, so it's an epsilon. We use the aorist active ending here. Of course, there's no sigma because this is irregular, enegka. Otherwise, it's the same. So to bring, auton, him. So putting it together then, while Jesus was preaching the gospel to the people, the Pharisees were commanding the soldiers to bring him. Second example, or second exercise from Machen. After Jesus had commanded the crowds to go away, his disciples came to him. So again, we can do this using either the infinitive or the participle. So I've given you both here. We'll start with the infinitive because that's the new information we have in this chapter. Meta, after, takes the accusative, ta, and then kalusai, after we have here Jesus had commanded. So this is the aorist active infinitive, and so kalusai. But notice that the aorist infinitive has an irregular accent. It's accented on the penult throughout. We noticed that earlier. So metatu kalusai, after the act of commanding. Infinitives have as their subject nouns in the accusative case. So after Jesus had commanded tous oklus, the crowds, apelthein, to go away. Remember that the second aorist infinitive is going to use the irregular accent. So this is the present aorist ending on the second aorist stem, and that always has this irregular accent. So after Jesus had commanded the crowds to go away, and then hoi mathetai, the disciples of him, his disciples, proseilthon, went, they went, third person plural, auto, to him. You could have, of course, used a form of simply eilthon, pros auton, if you'd wanted to. Either way, I use pros erkomai, which takes the dative. So if we're going to do this with the participle, then we would have here, once again, a genitive absolute. It's going to be an aorist participle referring to time preceding the time of the leading verb. So kalusantos, there's the genitive singular masculine ending, having commanded to Jesu, this is in the genitive case, Jesus having commanded tous oklus, the crowds, and then the rest of the sentence is the same, to go away, and so on. The disciples of him came to him. And here's our last composition exercise, number 3. It reads, if we wish to see Jesus, let us go into this village. Well, if we wish to see Jesus, we're going to assume that this is the indicative, a with the indicative, because it's obviously something we would expect would reflect a present reality. So we're going to say, if we wish, thelo is the word we have. It's in the indicative here, of course, so first person plural. If we wish, idain is a second aorist infinitive here, so we have the irregular accent in the second aorist with the present indicative ending here. So if we wish to see ton Jesun, in the accusative case, Jesus, proper names will ordinarily take the article, even though we don't translate it. If we wish to see Jesus, eilthomen, notice this is subjunctive, it's the hortatory subjunctive, first person plural, on the second aorist stem. So we have eilthomen, let us come, or let us go, more likely ace, into tautain, this, tain, the, komain, village. So you can see this one is actually fairly straightforward compared to the other ones. If we wish to see Jesus, let us go, or come, ace, tain, tautain, tain, komain, into this village. Well, hopefully that treatment of infinitives makes sense. Once again, as you well know, and I know I sound like a broken record here, but you should hopefully be getting a feel for this by now, that the real way to master this particular part of Greek grammar is to work through the exercises. I have once again provided to you the answer key, and obviously as you go through, you should be noting your work and comparing it against the exercises themselves. And if you find any problems, then certainly try to figure them out. Make sure you reread the chapter and have a good grasp of it. And once you've got this under control, then we'll move along to the next chapter, chapter 23, which treats contract verbs. And that'll be an interesting subject as well. So until then, we'll look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, God richly bless your studies of the Greek language.